Cheers. Um, I'd like to speak a little bit today about the Maronites and the Lebanese, specifically the Lebanese delegation to the 1919 Peace Conference, uh, which in the summer of 1919 was tasked with arguing for Lebanese independence. And it was headed then by Maronite Patriarch Elias Peter Hoyek, or Hoyek. Um, the Maronite Patriarchate today is under assault by Hezbollah epigons for having dared advocate recently for Lebanon's neutrality and demilitarization. And I think this is an opportune time to remind those with tenuous relationships with history, remind them of the organic coterminous relationship between the Maronites and Lebanon. But I should begin perhaps with a few words about the King Crane Commission. Now, the King Crane Commission, born at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, was assigned the role of serving the opinions of the local populations of what Europeans then referred to as Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Anatolia, serving the inhabitants of these regions with regards to the political future of that area following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Commission submitted its report to the Paris Peace Conference in August 1919, and in brief, the conclusions of the Commission's findings had been that the region in question, the Levant, essentially today's Lebanon, Syria, and Cilicia, which is to say the Hatay province of the current Republic of Turkey, and Palestine, including what is today Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories. The Commission concluded that those areas were not yet ripe, were not yet ready for independent political life. And thus, the King Crane Commission recommended the establishment of a League of Nations mandate, the purpose of which will have been to guide those regions in the process of self-determination and eventually independent statehood. Now, given the region's mosaics of cultural, ethnic, religious, and linguistic groupings, distinct nations, essentially by any other names, we call them religious groups or sects or communities. But those are cultural, ethnic groups. The King Crane Commission had recommended that whatever states should emerge in the Levant on, the debris of the defunct Ottoman Empire, whatever states emerge there, they'd have to be modern, liberal, democratic, and both respectful and protective of their minority populations, again, recognizing the mosaics of peoples and recognizing the, minority histories and minority narratives. In other words, the King Crane Commission was against reductive, coercive, irredentist, and hegemonic Arabism. It did not view that vision in favor. So obviously, those recommendations, as if you're, observers, interpreters, students of the modern Middle East, those recommendations did not eventuate, and the liberal democracies projected, or at least hoped for, by the King Crane Commission never came to be. In other words, the reductive, dogmatic vision of Arab nationalism came to dominate and consume and eventually dismantle the modern Middle East. You often hear the dominant post-colonialist cant about rapacious Western colonials carving out the Middle East and rending, dividing the Arab world. Well, sorry to shatter the illusions of this dominant, ideologically pleasing post-colonialist narrative. The acts of carving out and rending anything must presuppose a coherent, uniform, united precedent. Reality, however, is that there's never been an Arab world antecedent, nor a united Middle East preceding what became the modern states of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, and the rest. And if some of those states are on the verge of disappearing or transforming into unrecognizable entities today, it is thanks to the blinkered, fascistic, genocidal conceptions of identity advanced by a belligerent Arab nationalism. The only political system that we should aim for, famously wrote Sateh al-Husri, one of the founding fathers of Arab nationalism, the only political system that we as Arab nationalists should aim for, he said, ought to be a fascistic system, end quote. So there you have it. At any rate, the peoples of the Levantine regions of the defunct Ottoman Empire, Muslims, Christians, and Jews alike, were never particularly enthralled with the notion of Arab nationalism or with the idea that they were Arab peoples demanding and meriting an Arab state. Indeed, the term Arab is a modern concept, to a large extent, invented by the British, whose lodestar had been a land bridge supra-Arab state connecting the Eastern Mediterranean to the Indian subcontinent. But large swaths of Levantine peoples already had their own local identities and could not care less for a new alien construct called Arabism and Arab statehood. And here's how Shikri Ghanem, a late 19th and early 20th century Lebanese patriot and public intellectual and author who was working out of Paris, this is how he described Lebanese attitudes in 1919, in September of 1919, in an issue of his learned journal that he published in Paris, Correspondance d'Orient. A little bit of trivia, those of you who don't know Shikri Ghanem, who was born in 1861, died in 1929. He was a graduate of my alma mater, Collège Saint-Joseph in Antura. With the establishment of, so he was advocating for Greater Lebanon throughout his stay in Paris, and with the establishment of Greater Lebanon on September 1st, 1920, he deemed his life's struggles and life's work complete, and he would retire to a home he had purchased in the south of France in a little fisherman's hamlet called Antibes, if you've heard of it. It's an old Phoenician colony whose etymology quite possibly issues from the Canaanite phrase for clear water, Ain Tib, clear water or sweet water, eau douce, or l'eau des aromates for the francophones among you. In any case, Ghanem would also name that villa where he retired. He would name it La Libanaise, the Lebanese. The house still exists, by the way, if you happen to be in Antibes. Antibes, by the way, is no longer a small hamlet today. It's a place where you'd be lucky to own a closet. But the house still exists if you happen to be there, if you want to go pay your respects. This is actually a fine Lebanese restaurant also in the area, not too far from the house, called Le Phénicia. Check it out. The shawarma is to die for. In any case, here's how Shikri Ghanem described the Lebanese attitudes towards the looming League of Nations mandate in September 1919. This is a direct quote. In spite of tendentious information and falsities spread in Damascene Arab circles, the coastal populations of Lebanon and Syria, when given the liberty of expressing their views freely before the American Commission, that's how the King Crane Commission was called, they have spoken their fervent sympathies towards France and have said so in no uncertain terms to members of the Commission of Inquiry. In Saida, as well as throughout the Western Bekaa, the American Commission has noted that the majority of the population was demanding the reattachment to Lebanon, okay? Not attachment, the reattachment, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. They were demanding the reattachment to Lebanon under a League of Nations mandate. The feelings were expressed in the same feelings were expressed in Sur, Tyre, by almost the majority of the notables interviewed, Muslims and Christians alike. By contrast, in Tripoli, Muslims were advocating for the creation of a greater Syria under French guidance. In Lebanon, and save for a few dissenting Druze voices, the Lebanese population had been unanimous advocating for Lebanese independence under French protection. The excitement at the prospects of the statehood eventuating had been so vivid in certain towns and villages of the Lebanese mountain that people were urging the American members of the commission to belt out "Vive la France, long live France" in unison with the Lebanese populace. The Alawites of Antioch, a population of almost 40,000 souls, submitted a petition rejecting any form of an Arab government ruling over them, demanding French protection only, end quote. Now, this latter attitude of the Alawites, incidentally, is very interesting because it's confirmed in the subsequent creation of the state of the Alawite Mountain in 1920 and later in 1936, when the French were considering the possibility of attaching the Alawite Mountain to a future Syrian federation. In a petition submitted in 1923 by a group of Alawite notables to French senator and academicien Maurice Barrès, Suleiman al-Assad, grandfather of the current Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, Suleiman al-Assad noted the following, quote, "It is with immense gratitude that we applaud Barrès's unfailing defense and advocacy on behalf of our nascent Alawite state, a young state which some seek to unjustly attach to a future Arab-Syrian federation, oblivious to the will of the overwhelming majority of the Alawite people. We urge you and the French National Assembly to take all measures necessary to safeguard our continued and complete autonomy under the auspices of French protection. And we ask that you kindly accept our heartfelt appreciation and warmest regards," etc. Now, the Alawites, at their head, the same Suleiman al-Assad who would in time beget the Middle East's most brutal dictators, Hafez and Bashar, he would follow suit in 1936 with a memorandum to the French Prime Minister at the time, Léon Blum, almost begging him to prevent the Alawite Mountain state being folded into a larger Syrian federation or a Syrian union. The Syrians are too ethnically fragmented to merit a single unitary state, argued Suleiman al-Assad, and the abolition of the mandate would leave the Alawites prey to annihilation by Muslim mobs, he said. Quote, "The Alawite people appeal to the French government to guarantee their freedom and independence within the small Alawite territory," end quote. And here I'm going to read you a few nuggets from that same memorandum that reveal a lot about how the Alawites felt vis-a-vis an enlarged Syrian Arab federation. The granting of independence to Syria and abolishing the mandate constitute a good example of the socialist principles in Syria. He was addressing Léon Blum, was a socialist prime minister in France. But absolute independence means the control by some Muslim families of the Alawi people in Cilicia, Iskenderun, the Hatay province of today's Turkey, and the Nusaidi Mountains, as to the presence of a parliament and constitutional government that does not represent individual freedoms. This parliamentary rule is no more than false appearances without any value. In truth, it covers up a regime dominated by religious fanaticism against the minorities. Do French leaders really want the Muslims to have control over the Alawi people in order to throw them into misery? The spirit of hatred and fanaticism embedded in the hearts of the Arab Muslims against anything that is non-Muslim has been perpetually nurtured by the Islamic religion. There is no hope that this situation will ever change. Therefore, the abolition of the mandate will expose the minorities in Syria to the dangers of death and annihilation, irrespective of the fact that such abolition will annihilate the freedom of thought and belief. And it goes on and on and on. He goes on a rant defending the Jews in British Mandate Palestine and how the Jews are being persecuted by Muslims, etc., etc. Now, 17 years prior to this, those were exact quotes, by the way. 17 years before that text, which some may consider a vitriolic text, but I suggest it be read and deserves to be read in its historical context. But 17 years before that text, the Maronite patriarch, Elias Peter Huyck, was addressing in similar terms the leaders of the Entente Alliance at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. Worth noting here before and in response to the vitriol of those who were attacking today's Maronite patriarch for daring to advocate for a free, independent, neutral Lebanon, I want to say a few words about what the Maronite patriarch's role is and who the Maronites are. Rather than being simply a faith community, a Christian community tout court, the Maronites are what political scientists refer to as pre-modern national church, a pre-modern national church, which is to say a national group in modern terms defined in religious terms. By way of comparison, one might say the Catholic Church, for instance, is a universal church. It's not a national church, right? It's a missionizing universal church. Just like the Muslim church, if we can refer to Islam as a church, is also a universal proselytizing church. In that sense, anyone speaking any language, issuing from any national group or any ethnicity, can be a Catholic or a Muslim. Conversely, the Maronite Church is what is defined as a pre-modern national church, which is to say a church specific to a distinct national group. Relevant modern examples of other pre-modern national churches would include, for instance, the Church of England or the Church of Norway or the Church of Sweden and many others. And note in this regard, for instance, that the head of the Church of England today is not a prelate. It's not the Archbishop of Canterbury, but it's the Queen of England is the head of the National Church of England. So the same applies to the Maronite Church, a pre-modern national church, which is to say a nation before the term nation became current, headed by the Maronite Patriarch of Antioch and the whole of the Levant. That's the official title of the Patriarch of the Maronite Church. So in that sense, the Maronite Patriarch is not merely a prelate or a religious leader as are the European dignitaries of the Catholic Church, but indeed the Maronite Patriarch holds a position that combines spiritual and secular political characteristics. At once a moral authority, but also a national political authority that once bestowed upon the Patriarch also military powers and military responsibilities. Those are the qualities that conferred on Patriarch Elias Peter Huyck in 1919 the role of representing the Lebanese desiderata, the Lebanese hopes or desires at the 1919 Peace Conference. And those are the same qualities that allow the Patriarch of today, Pshara Peter Rai, to advocate for an independent Lebanon, demilitarized Lebanon, and a neutral Lebanon. In that sense, the Maronite community represents a group with a particular identity and a highly organized political personality, intimately wedded to geographic Lebanon. And so here's how Patriarch Huyck in 1919 begins his address to begins his memorandum to the Peace Conference. My coming to Paris, he says, quote, is in a strictly official capacity. I'm here by the authorization of Lebanon's Administrative Council, a democratically elected body, a bona fide parliament, if you will, which represents explicitly the Lebanese public opinion, and in whose name I am authorized to address this venerable body. Besides the Lebanese Administrative Council, I have also received the authorization of the overwhelming majority of the spiritual and confessional leaders of territories demanding their reattachment to Lebanon's natural historical frontiers. Note that term reattachment, which I mentioned in a different context earlier. What I am requesting from the members of the Peace Conference is indeed quite simple. And this is essentially the summary of an hour and a half address that the Patriarch gave before the Peace Conference. So what I am requesting from the members of the Peace Conference is indeed quite simple, because our desires can be expressed in very few simple words. The simple independence of a Lebanon redeemed and restored in its natural frontiers, reclaiming territories torn from Lebanon by Turkey, and the backing of our friend of all times, France, to help us realize our national goals. End quote. That's it. Naturally, as I said before, the Patriarch's address was much more elaborate and much lengthier than what I've quoted, but the above is a pithy summary, if you will. Beyond the introductory remarks, the Patriarch would embark on a veritable history lesson, tracing the history of Lebanon, the culture of Lebanon, the languages of Lebanon, and he traces them back from the Phoenician times to modern times, establishing before his audience the perennial nature of what he calls the natural historical Phoenician homeland. And so there you have it. Those are the Maronites. They're not angry Maronites. It's just, a statement of fact. This is their connection to Lebanon. This is the role that the Maronite Patriarch has always held in Lebanon as a representative of not only a faith community, but a national group, a pre-modern national church that is intimately wedded to the Lebanese territory. The First Nation of Lebanon, if you will. We're not going to argue over that. It's not, it's not an opinion. It's a statement of fact. And I'm happy to hear commentaries and address any of your questions or objections. Thank you for listening. I made it quite shorter this time, 22 minutes. Thank you for lending me your attention. And until next time, cheers.